So good evening. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our first CCHM Speaker Series program of 2021. Now, these talks are sponsored by the Historic Preservation Commission of Clark County and Wager Audio. Our mission here at the Clark County Historical Museum is to gather, save, and share the pieces and memories of Clark County. Now, the Society has been performing this mission for more than 100 years. And at the museum, we have been showing Clark County history and sharing it for more than 50 years. Now, the core way we communicate Clark County's story is through programs, exhibits, and events. Now, even though we're not able to open the building right now, we have quite a bit going on here at the museum for 2021. Now, this year, our speaker series, we have a theme. Our talks are themed around our community, past, present, and future. Now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we are not able to start our series in person in this room right here as we had for so many years. And so as a result, we're going to be bringing the talks to you digitally for the time being. Now, we're working to ensure the safety and comfort of all our speakers. So as a result, each presentation is uniquely designed. See, our paramount goal with these talks is to continue to bring the stories of our community to you in one form or another. And we just want to thank everyone who watched all of our talks and our walks and engaged with us in 2020 and who is continuing to engage with us, and the folks that are new to be here tonight. We really can't thank you enough for continuing to be a part of our effort to tell the stories of Clark County. So just thank you so much for your support and being here tonight. Now, this program tonight wouldn't have been possible without the generous support and program sponsorship of Indivisible Greater Vancouver. Now, their contribution, it just means a lot to the whole CCHM family. And so if you're not familiar with Indivisible Greater Vancouver, please check out their website and find out what they're doing here in Clark County and beyond. Now, before we start tonight's program, we want to let you know about some of the great new offerings and programs that we have slated for 2021. Now, members, you know, we couldn't serve Clark County without your support and what you have done for us. Throughout 2020, our membership stepped up time and time again to help us keep going through what has been a pretty difficult time for everyone. So if you haven't had a chance yet, we've been working to do some things for our members. If you haven't had the time, please explore the brand new members portal on our website. And through this portal, you can get a chance to engage with all kinds of newly available content that we've been able to create. So members, we really can't thank you enough for what you've done, for sticking with us and continuing to support what we do here at the museum. So now our programs, we told you that we're going to do. This is going to come to you digitally. So it's going to be History on Tap on February 18th at 7 p.m. And this one is going to be titled Adaptation, the Open Secret of Humanity's Origins, Global Diversity, and Distant Future. So on this one, you're going to get to spend an evening with anthropology professor, author, and Pacific Space Flight co-founder, Dr. Cameron Smith. So he's going to explore evolution, indigenous perspectives, and inform us on how all this informs our distant future. So we're really excited to be kicking off our History on Tap season with Dr. Cameron Smith, and we just really can't thank him enough for being a part of our program. And also, we'll continue to be supporting the Kiggins Theater and working with the Kiggins Theater during this program until we can get back in there. So for our next speaker series program, that's going to be on March 4th at 7 p.m. and it's going to be titled, If These Walls Could Talk, the 1918 Flu Pandemic in Clark County. And so we're really excited about this one because it's a partnership between the Historic Trust and the museum. We'll have Holly Chamberlain and myself will be discussing the 1918 flu pandemic and its impacts on Clark County as a community, and also from an architectural historic architecture perspective. And we'll be focusing on the Red Cross building. So in addition to the programs, we still have our exhibits up. I'm actually in the exhibit gallery for our women's history exhibit, Her Story. We still have History of Brewing up. We still have Currents of Progress and Music, Movement, and Sound. And so when we're able to open back up, these exhibits are still available for you to come into the museum and see when that time is possible. In addition, we have our outdoor gallery that we were able to build, and that one has our Clark County Stories exhibit. And in addition, you can help add to our collection over this time. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we opened up the Capture the Moment collection. And so you can submit videos, audio, photos, digital writing, anything through this. So please check out our website for details on the Capture the Moment, and please help donate to that and tell the story of this time. And if you want to know more, please sign up for our email list, follow us on social media. All of this, you'll be able to receive updates and reminders about upcoming events. And if you like our programs, our events, our exhibits, many of you have known us for many years, please continue to be, and if you're not, get involved. There's 3 ways that you can really help. Your time, which is to watch a program like this, engage with something that we have on one of our websites. Energy, which is volunteer, help us out. We have lots of remote volunteer opportunities, or invest, which is support us through donations or membership. So tonight's talk is featuring historian Melissa Williams, and she is going to share the story of housing and Vancouver's African American community from 1940 to 1960. In this, you're going to learn how Black families made Southwest Washington their home during wartime, what factors pushed many out of the area after the war, and then also about the lasting contributions these first Black residents made to Vancouver. Now, Melissa Williams is a 33-year resident of Vancouver and a U.S. historian who concentrates on African American history. So over the past 20 years, she has contributed to numerous projects for organizations and educational institutions, including the Center for Columbia River History, the Vancouver NAACP 1139, the Clark County Historical Museum, we've worked with Melissa, and Portland State University. Now, Williams earned a BA in history from the University of Washington and a master's in public history from Washington State University, Vancouver. And we want to just thank again Melissa for being the speaker tonight, and also we want to thank our sponsor for the program, Indivisible Greater Vancouver, for their support, and then also the Historic Preservation Commission and Wager Audio for being sponsors for our 2021 season. We really can't thank you all enough, and without further ado, let's go ahead and go to our program for this evening.
Hi, my name is Melissa Williams, and I am excited to be the February 2021 speaker for the Clark County Historical Museum's speaker series. Today, I'm going to be sharing some history about the African American experience in Vancouver and Clark County during World War II and after World War II with regard to housing. And so I will introduce myself. I am a 30-plus year resident of Vancouver. I'm a U.S. historian who concentrates on African American history. I have a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Washington and a master's degree in public history from Washington State University, Vancouver. And to create this presentation, I borrowed from my master's thesis, Those Who Desire Very Much to Stay, African Americans and Housing in Vancouver, Washington, 1940 to 1960. And from the book, First Families of Vancouver's African American Community, from World War II to the 21st Century by Jane Elder Wolfe. And I'll talk a little bit about the book at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to start with some overview history, and I have skipped a lot because I'm starting here on this slide in 1900. So we know that this area has such a rich and long history, of course, beginning with our Indigenous friends and neighbors But I am starting here in the interest of time. And so in 1900 and up to 1940, of course, the layout of Clark County has Vancouver as its county seat. And Vancouver is mostly west of where I-5 runs today. So our downtown area and our older neighborhoods on the west side of the city comprise what was geographically a very much smaller area. I'm going to start with 1900, and I know that cuts out a lot of our rich past and history, but in the interest of time, I'm going to speed us up to these decades, 1900 to 1940, just for an overview of the area at that time. So Vancouver, of course, is the county seat, and most of Vancouver geographically is just a small area that is west of where I-5 runs today. So our downtown area and those older neighborhoods on the west side. The industries or economies are agriculture, lumber, fishing, and mills primarily. Our large agricultural exports are fruit. We are the self-proclaimed prune capital of the world at this time, and that was a really big deal. People from all over the region would come and participate in festivals and parades and would crown the prune queen. And demographically, the county has about 50,000 people in 1940. And that balloons up to almost twice as much during wartime, 99,000 as a snapshot in time. It was difficult to capture the wartime population because it was, of course, mid-time between censuses, and then also because there was so much movement of people that, you might capture 99,000 on one day, but then a few weeks later could have been more or could have been a little less. The city of Vancouver at this time had about 18,000 people in 1940, and then 68,000 in wartime. Again, that 68,000 could have been a little more or a little less depending on when we're calculating the population. And then just a reminder, 1940, 92% of Vancouverites are white American born. And that will come into play a little bit later in our story here. So the migration of African Americans is actually this really long period of time in the United States, and the World War II movement fits into this larger story. And so you might have heard of this period called the Great Migration, and this was this movement of African Americans out of southern states north and west. And historians dispute exactly when this started. Some say as early as the 1870s, in that period of Reconstruction right after the Civil War, where there's a white backlash and a very violent kind of resurgence of white supremacy, the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, for instance. And so that time period was very tumultuous. And some historians identify later, the 1910s, 19-teens, as the start of this time. And it goes to 1960s, 1970. And there are pull and push factors operating here. And so the pull factors, the factors that are luring or attracting Black families to move north and to move west, are primarily economics. And so they are being drawn to these high-paying jobs in the more industrialized north and in the west. And so these would be jobs in factories, steel mills, railroads, meatpacking plants, automobile industry. This is where we see those large northern cities getting these higher Black populations: Chicago, Detroit, New York. This is the movement that is prompting the population growth in those areas. And then there are also push factors out of an area. And so this wasn't only about economics. This wasn't only about getting higher pay and being able to provide for your family better. There was also this desire to escape the hostility and domestic terror that was happening mostly in the South at this time. And so Jim Crow segregation in every single aspect of public life, arson, beatings, lynchings, rape. And if you're familiar with Rosa Parks's early story, her story before she became the bus boycott icon, her job was to support survivors of sexual violence, and she would travel and offer support and resources to women who had been raped. And largely, a lot of these Black women who've been raped were raped by white men, and that was used as a weapon of racial subjugation. It was very common, and this is becoming more and more researched. There's a lot of documentation coming out, and a couple of people have written books on this. This very rarely discussed aspect of white supremacy violence. So if you're interested in this bigger story of the migration of African Americans and these massive demographic shifts that happened in our nation because of this migration, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson is a beautiful, I will say, masterpiece of work that she compiled to tell that really compelling story. So check it out if you have not already read that book or had the chance to at least skim through it. So World War II fits into that great migration story. This is yet another wave, another piece of that larger narrative. And of course, this was for a very deliberate reason, and our participation in World War II. And so people were moving for these jobs, these war industry jobs. And here that was mostly shipyards, aluminum, and the railroad. And the way people heard about these jobs was through recruiters and through friends and family. So the shipyards had people whose job it was to travel the country and encourage workers to come to the shipyards. And so they would travel around and talk to folks and do that piece. But then the friends and family who were brave and courageous enough, those first folks who took the leap to come out to the Pacific Northwest and to secure a job and to secure housing, would then tell their family and friends, hey, I've checked it out. This is legit. Come on out. And so that word of mouth was really, really important because people were hearing about those opportunities from each other. And that spurred, kind of wave after wave of people going out. So there was large Southern recruitment, Black and white folks in the South. And a lot of that was because the economic opportunities in the South were just generally fewer, monolithically speaking, than people. So the World War II movement that we see with African Americans is part of that larger Great Migration story. And this is one wave of that story. And for very deliberate reasons. Of course, Black families who were moving around at this time were often moving to secure jobs in the war industries. And so for us in our area, that was mostly shipyards, aluminum, and railroads. The way that families heard about these jobs was through marketers, recruiters, and also friends and family. And so the shipyards had recruiters who would travel the country and encourage people to take these shipyard jobs. And then also those first few courageous folks who came out to secure those jobs would then tell their friends and family, okay, I came out, I got a job, I have housing, this is legit, come on and bring other people with you. And so that was the way that folks learned about this opportunity and decided to make the move. There was large Southern recruitment of both Black and white people because economic opportunity in the South was generally less available than in other parts of the country. And so this was a kind of a prime market, a prime target for employers who were looking for people to work in their companies and their industries. So this spurs that really mass movement of African Americans North and West for these jobs. And so who were the Black people who were coming to Clark County? They were not always families. Sometimes they were single adults who were coming to earn money, temporarily earn money and send funds back home, maybe for the duration of a war, maybe for a year or two, however long it made sense to do that. And then also, the folks experiencing or coming to the Northwest were still experiencing this racial tension and this racial violence in some ways. And so I call it the same problem with a different look. Blacks are trading this openly hostile Southern white violence a lot of times for this passively aggressive Pacific Northwest whiteness. So Black people continue to experience racist systems in employment, housing, healthcare, et cetera, and continue to encounter that interpersonal bigotry and prejudice and discrimination. And it's worth remembering that not just Black families are moving to Vancouver or Clark County. White families from the South are moving here too, and they are bringing along with them their attitudes and their perspectives. And so we still have a lot of racial tension that's carried over from just Southern culture that people are encountering here, not to mention white culture in general in the United States. So even if white folks were from the Midwest or the Great Lakes or the West, they still had their own prejudices and preconceptions about Black people. So a snapshot for you for some information. The top 5 states of origin for new Black Vancouverites were Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. And the jobs that these folks most often held in their home states were labor jobs. So farm workers, mechanics, laborers, maids and carpenters, laundry employees, etc. Teachers as well. And then the wartime jobs that they were moving to were mostly related, of course, to the shipyards. So folks who were welders, chippers, painters, pipe fitters, tank cleaners, etc. The average Black family coming to Vancouver was a family of 4, and that's pretty small. If you're thinking, this is 1940s, people tended to have larger families then. That is a small number, and we have a little evidence as to why in the next bullet point, which is that most Black adults who were coming out were between the ages of 19 and 30 and had fewer children with them than their white counterparts. And what that is evidence of is that people were leaving children at home with maybe family or friends, relatives to come out and work in the shipyards and probably send money home. So this wasn't necessarily everybody looking to uproot and relocate their entire family to the Pacific Northwest. This was sometimes just a very practical kind of work endeavor where you were going to work for a period of time and then return home to your children and family and friends. Conditions in the states of origin, a significant number of families had lived in homes without indoor toilets or no showers or tubs, no indoor plumbing or electric lighting. That was very common for lots of families in the 1940s, not just Black families, but the census collected information, for example, on who had indoor plumbing, and a significant number of Americans in 1940 did not have those amenities. And so this was common, especially for rural areas and especially for poor areas. And the social conditions in states of origin, typically Black people were doing domestic work or working in white people's homes for very low pay. There was, of course, the fear of violence from white vigilantes or white terrorists, Jim Crow segregation, segregated schools, which were often a comfort and an injustice. And I say a comfort because Black children attending all Black schools with Black teachers was community building. That was safe, that was comfortable, and that was a way that children could go to school and not have to worry about the prejudices from white teachers or being bullied from white children. So it was comfort in that way. It was an injustice in that those schools were so massively under-resourced and underfunded, and we know that created this inherent inequity between the educational experiences of white children versus the educational experiences of Black children. So I'm going to share just a few recollections from some of the members of First Families that came to this area. Andrew Davis's family came from Alabama in 1943 after his father's sawmill had been destroyed by arson for the 5th time. His father had worked for years and years to earn enough money to purchase a sawmill and hired employees who were both Black and white. And this caused his success, caused resentment among some white people in their town. And so he would rebuild each time his mill was burned down. But by the fifth time, he just said, forget it, we're leaving. And so he came to Vancouver to scope out the area before he sent for his wife and children to come out so that they could begin a new life here. Belva Jean Griffin's widowed mother moved her and her two siblings from Oklahoma in 1944, where her mother did domestic work for $1 a day. And they were barely scraping by, especially because her husband passed and they lost his income. So this was a really significant opportunity for her mother to take care of her children. So they settled in Vanport before moving to Vancouver, and the flood of 1948 destroyed their home in Vanport. Vanport was an Oregon war housing city and project where Delta Park is now. And there was a Memorial Day flood, massive flood that destroyed that housing project in 1948. Ida Jones recalled a crowded train trip from Kansas with her children in 1942. Her husband Oliver had already come earlier and then sent for her and her children. And she remembers just all of this movement, so many people crowding the train and then walking out into the Portland's Union train station into a sea of people on the move. There was so much happening in this time period in big cities, especially with, soldiers moving and families moving and just lots and lots of activity in this time. Val Joshua and her husband came from Texas in 1944, following his parents who lived in McLaughlin Heights war housing. And the Joshuas would help found the Vancouver NAACP in 1945. And they, along with others, worked tirelessly for equal rights and employment, housing, education, and the justice system over the next several decades. And Val Joshua's name might be familiar to you. She was a pillar of our community and a fierce advocate for justice and equity. And the Val Joshua Racial Justice Award from the YWCA is named after her. So let's look a little bit more at some demographics. I carried over the population totals from that earlier slide. You can see Clark County's totals and the city of Vancouver's totals kind of in the middle of the slide there. But the graph shows the African-American population of Vancouver from 1900 to 1960. And so you can see these very small populations before 1944, just tens of African Americans living in Vancouver. That shoots up to almost 9,000 in 1944, which was the height of our Black population in Vancouver during wartime. And then drops way back down to just under 900 in 1950, and then 10 years later, just under 500 in 1960. And so the two questions might naturally kind of pop up for you here. Number one, what was it like for a community that had only a few Black people living here to all of a sudden have 9,000 Black people living here? What was that? What did that feel like for the residents, and what did that feel like for the Black families who were coming here? That's one question. The second might be, what happened after 1944? That just in that 6-year period to 1950, we see this significant drop. You would expect that some people had come to the area for war work to be temporary here and to not put down deep roots here, but surely some significant number of people maybe wanted to stay in the area. So what prompted that massive drop? We're going to talk about both of those things. But for this influx of people, not just Black people, but all people coming to this area for war work, there was, of course, a housing shortage. Vancouver was not in any way prepared to house all of these people coming, tens of thousands in a very short period of time. And so people lived in barns, sheds, basements, attics, cars, tents. People were squished everywhere. Everybody became a landlord. If you owned property, if you had an outbuilding, or you wanted housemates, people living in your home with you, you could rent out your spaces. People were, doubling up, tripling up in homes. It was chaotic and it was very crowded. And so the Vancouver Housing Authority, of course, is created to address this housing shortage, this massive problem. We want to provide workers for Kaiser Shipyard and other industries, but we have to have places for people to live in order to do that. And so the VHA is convened in early 1941, very quickly, because we went to war in very late 1941, December 1941. So pretty quickly, I think it was 60 some days after we declared war, the VHA was operating. And eventually we have 6 Vancouver Housing Authority projects with names that are familiar to you: McLaughlin Heights, Fruit Valley, Bagley Downs, etc., plus 5,000 dormitory units that were mostly for bachelors and single men. So dormitories aside, Vancouver erected a total of 12,000 plus units with a capacity for 50,000 people. But because of the high turnover in war work, over the course of the war, about 190,000 people lived in this public housing, this government public housing, which is really incredible to think about in that short period of years. Almost 200,000 people cycling through for this place that had just been a little town before the war. So what was the VHA housing like? Well, it depended on where you lived. Some houses, some units were intended to be more permanent than others. And so some had some sturdy construction at first, but then as the speed of construction had to increase to keep pace with demand, the materials became less quality, and the construction became less quality as well. And keep in mind that a lot of this housing was intended to be temporary anyhow, and so it was not necessarily built to last. That wasn't the point or the purpose. The projects, the layouts of the projects themselves sometimes meant that there was a lack of privacy. And so that was a big concern that you'll hear from narrators of this time capturing their personal stories. They'd say, oh, there was no privacy in these places, like paper thin walls, the buildings could be close together. If you lived in row houses, you heard everything from your neighbors all the time. And keep in mind that this is a 24-hour situation. These projects, people are working in shipyards, and those shipyards are running 3 shifts a day, every day, all day. And so you are hearing people talking and arguing and cooking food and everything, all of the sounds of life going on in these homes 24 hours a day. As far as amenities, there was some upgrade in the your quality of life for lots of people, because these homes had ice boxes to keep your food cool. They had coal or electric heat, electric lighting. The single family homes were 2-bedroom with 1 bath. And so when you're comparing that to the homes that people were often coming from in these poorer rural areas of the country, this was amazing. You could move from maybe what was more like a shack, a 1-room shack, from Kentucky with no plumbing and no electric lighting, and then come to this home that was brand new construction with all of these amenities plus a good paying job. That was life-changing for so many families. And you lived in these projects with neighbors from all over the country. You met people from places you never thought you'd meet people. And there was lots of activity, families constantly moving in and constantly moving out. So bustling, lots and lots of activity. And then community life, the projects would often organize community social events. And then, of course, people on their own would organize events for each other. So there just could be fairs, movies, parties, dances, clubs, arts and cultural events. These events were not racially segregated by the Vancouver Housing Authority. So the VHA is, of course, managing these public housing projects, but they're not necessarily coordinating all of these events, and there is no policy of racial segregation. But because of our time and our culture, a lot of people socially just segregated on their own. And so Willard Nettles Jr., one of our first family members, remembers that if there was a party, that would not have been integrated. He said there were no integrated parties. White folks would throw parties for white folks. Black folks should throw parties for black folks, etc. But things like sports and arts events and those types of things were often integrated. So the number one question I get when people find out that I've researched this piece of our history is, did the Vancouver Housing Authority racially segregate its housing? And the answer to that is complicated. So the Vancouver Housing Authority boasted integrated housing. There was no official policy of racial discrimination on the books, and that was unlike Portland and Seattle housing authorities. And so Vancouver was very proud of that. The architects of the housing authority were very proud of this. However, some Black families suspected that there was an unofficial practice of racially segregating housing at the unit level. And so some Black families recall living in integrated housing. And they said, I lived with people from all over the country, and I lived with white people and Black people and everybody. But other Black families remember that they lived in an all Black unit, and were thinking, how could that just have happened, by a fluke, that all the Black families are together in this one unit. And so there's some discrepancy there, and that often happens with history. Historians are used to discrepancies. But that's the information that we have on those two sides. Now, the Vancouver Housing Authority explained racial grouping of residents as a fluke of the first come, first served arrival system that they had in place. And so, what that means is that the Vancouver Housing Authority was saying, once you send out recruiters and they're heavily recruiting, say in Texas, then a couple weeks later, you've got a mass influx of people from Texas. Like you could see how the one action would align with the other. A recruiter would go and then lots of people would come. And so they were saying, then you'd have people just by happenstance migrating to Vancouver together. There happened to be lots and lots of people from Texas. They're coming to the Vancouver Housing Authority to get assigned to housing, and boom, they're placed in the housing that's available at the time. And so they happen to live together in these projects because they came here together. So that is their explanation for anything that would resemble racial grouping of residents. That was an explanation that didn't sit well necessarily with Black residents, and who were thinking that's not really very likely that is how people would have been assigned to housing, or that assignment style would result in all Black families living in all Black units. And so that is the unsatisfying answer to that question, that there is a difference of perspective, and also just something that is not easily resolvable based on human memory and what documentation we have from the time. So the Vancouver NAACP, Branch 1139, was founded in March 1945 by an interracial group. And this group of folks immediately focused on employment and housing for Black residents. They knew that those were going to be the primary issues for Black families who wanted to stay in Vancouver after the war. And so this group consistently pushed in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s for employment opportunities and affordable private housing that was free from discrimination. And they collaborated. They partnered with the Vancouver Housing Authority, the city, the Mayor's Commission on Fair Housing, the Council of Churches, YWCA, and other state organizations, as well as local entities, to get this work done. And they also worked with companies to hire Black employees, or to hire more than just one or two Black employees. And so that they worked with companies like Crown Zellerbach, Alcoa, and Hidden Brick Company. Often they had to do a lot of persuading, to hey, it's in your benefit to have Black employees and to diversify your workforce, or it's in your benefit to allow Black folks in your neighborhood. Your housing prices won't drop, and so or your house values won't drop. And so that's a lot of the work that they did, was going into the community and educating folks on the values of a diverse community and the importance of democratic processes so people had equal access. And the NAACP was using data to inform its initiatives and to inform its education practices. And some of the data that they were using came from the Vancouver Housing Authority. A survey of Negro tenants is a 1945 survey that the VHA conducted to determine how many Black families wanted to stay in Vancouver. And of those families, what were their employment and housing prospects? And so you might ask, well, what's their motivation? What is the VHA's motivation for this survey? Was it to determine how they could support Black families and help them stay in Vancouver, or was it to try to mitigate some kind of problem, if they thought Black families were going to be a problem in Vancouver. And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know the motivation. I can't say there were Black folks working for the Vancouver Housing Authority who were involved in this survey, to Black men who were involved in this survey. So hopefully the motivation is to support families, but we cannot say for sure. 1,200 families were surveyed. About a third of them had been laid off for more industry jobs by late 1945 when this survey was conducted. And only 12% were employed in work unrelated to the war. And that is concerning, because if you have a significant population or a significant number of Black families that indicate they want to stay in Vancouver, yet only 12% were employed in work that was unrelated to the war, that was a misalignment. That was an issue, because how were they going to afford to stay here if they were not finding employment in non-war related work? And in fact, about 60% of families surveyed said they did plan to remain in Vancouver. And that's a significant number, 60%. And 24%, a quarter, planned to definitely leave as soon as their employment ended. And then about 1 in 5 families were undecided, or would stay if there happened to be work opportunities. So predictably, those who were out of work indicated they were more likely to leave than those who still had jobs. And the following year, the VHA conducts another survey. So that was late 1945. This is now late 1946. And the VHA is following up and seeing what employment information they could gather from residents. And so at this time, most Black people worked for SP&S Railway as track laborers, in civil service at Barnes Hospital, private businesses, a cannery, or in domestic work. And in 1947, just 200 Black families remained in VHA housing. So, 1945 was that first survey, and there were 1,200 Black families interviewed. And then about a year and a half later, there are only 200 Black families living in this housing. Now, that doesn't mean that there were only 200 Black families in Vancouver. These families simply could have moved out of housing. But you can see that huge drop happening after the war, those populations going down for the number of African Americans in the public housing. So the reasons that Black families indicated they wanted to stay in the area are the same that any of us would identify when we're thinking about putting down roots and purchasing a home and raising a family. They just liked the area. A lot of people said it was small enough to be comfortable. Consider that a lot of folks are coming from rural areas or small towns, and Vancouver felt manageable to them. It felt comfortable to them as opposed to a large city, but they knew they had access to Portland, so they could access a large city if they wanted to. They felt it was a good place to raise a family. They felt that the schools were good. They liked the climate, not necessarily the weather, but the climate with mild winters and mild summers. And so those are some of the reasons that people found this place attractive. And of course, they're building relationships with each other. If you're here for a couple years, you're meeting people, you're in civic organizations, you're in a church, you're raising children, and your children have relationships. And so there is an anchoring effect that is happening for these folks and a lot of young families. When you're raising your young family, you might feel very connected to a place because you don't want to maybe uproot your children and take a risk moving somewhere else. So even though a significant number of Black families want to stay in the area, many could not. And this has to do with employment and private housing. And so post-war and into the 1950s, the city is making plans for what to do with housing. So the war industries, of course, have scaled down, and the city is coming up with a new plan to use those project properties. They'd cleared acres and acres and acres of land all around the outskirts of the old kind of core city of Vancouver to build these public housing projects. And they put in infrastructure. There were roads and sewers and water tanks and electricity. And so they are figuring, well, what do we do with this? We can tear down our temporary housing, but what do we do with all of this land? And so there was at this time a heavy concern among some longtime white residents that public housing would be a blight in the city. There was an small but active lobby who wanted to drastically reduce or completely eliminate all forms of public housing. They put up with it during wartime because that was for a specific effort and purpose, but now they said that's over and we need to get our community back to private housing because of the stereotypes and the stigma that comes along with people who are accessing public housing. So the city is similar. They're on that kind of on that track, but they're not. The city's not completely opposed to all public housing, but definitely is moving in the direction where they are looking for private developments more than anything, and so drastically reduced public housing is the vision of the city planners, and so they are moving toward the private developments most, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But by December 31st, 1958, the VHA closes its last project, McLaughlin Heights. So that's quite a significant length of time after the war. War ended in 45, and so that was a significant amount of time. And over this time, the city was actively helping people find housing outside of their projects. So they didn't just say, okay, war ended in 45 and we're shutting down in 2 months. They were very generous in still operating this public housing that was affordable for people as this transition was happening. People were transitioning to other jobs. People were looking for places to live. They were very generous in allowing those projects to remain open. But the last one closed in 1958. All of the families had to be out by then, and all of the families were out actually earlier than this date. So they all met that deadline. So this private development that city managers envisioned was this post-war city of middle-class suburbanites. That was the goal for the planners. And at this time, coincidentally, there was a nationwide shortage of building materials, and this limited the developers' ability to construct a large quantity, a large number of homes. And so they chose instead to do quality homes and, that were moderately expensive or expensive. And the effect of that was that it excluded low income and working class families, and it excluded African American families because they most often fell on the low side of the economic continuum because of discrimination in employment opportunity. And so by these things coming together, by the city managers envisioning this middle-class suburban city and the shortage of materials that limited the number of homes that could actually be built, those forces acted against Black families who wanted to stay in this area. And I can't even, I don't have time to even get into all the employment pieces of this story, but those are so critical to the housing story. So private development, some Black families were able to put down roots. In 1958, the NAACP Housing Committee attempted to track the whereabouts of Black families who moved out of McLaughlin Heights and see if they were successful or not in securing housing in the private sector. So the Housing Committee identified 40 families that left the Heights that year. And of the 40, 30 had been able to move into private housing in Vancouver, which is hopeful. It's a good number. Of those 30 families, some were renting homes, some were building, some were buying, and 3 families were unaccounted for. But that looks very hopeful on the surface. However, we are only talking about 30 families when we were talking about 1,200 families earlier, and even 200 families, in 1947. But now we're down to a very small Black population. And here are some quotes and some information from people firsthand. Joseph Harrison said, after the shipyards closed in 1945, you couldn't get a job. It was very, very difficult to secure employment for Black people, especially. Belva Jean Griffin says she remembers when everybody had to move from the Heights and you couldn't get a house anywhere because people wouldn't rent to you. She said her sister called somebody who had a house near Clark College. She called and asked if the house was for rent, and the person said yes. And she says, I remember that I went with my sister and brother-in-law to see it. He parked the car and we began to get out, but the man came to the door, looked, and shook his head. So he shook his head no to them, as in he would not rent to them. When Hosea Lewis and her young family tried to move into a Fruit Valley housing development, they were met with threats of arson. And so those were some of the experiences and some of the attitudes people faced. In 1957, an incident with a white woman who protested her neighbor's plan to rent one side of her duplex to an African-American family. In 1958, reporter Jack Roberts noted an incident in which a white woman circulated a petition in her community in an attempt to force out a newly arrived Black family in her neighborhood. And through its investigations, the NAACP Housing Committee discovered a pattern in white neighborhoods. So Reverend John Saltman described this pattern as when a Black family would move into a white neighborhood, residents would first oppose vigorously. They would often phone the city, they'd phone realtors and sellers and landlords, they'd make a big fuss. And then as time passed, the commotion would settle. And so the NAACP and other organizations that they were working with would do a lot of education efforts for white homeowners. Number one, ensuring or reassuring them that their housing values would not fall just because a Black family moved into the neighborhood. And number two, trying to convince white homeowners that the things would settle. Like, just let a family move in and you'll see over time that it's fine, that there is no danger, there is no economic danger, and that everything would work out if you would just, kind of get past your initial hesitance or hostility. And so there is also evidence that realtors may have individually worked to prevent Black families from buying houses, in addition to private sellers and landlords refusing to sell or rent to Black people. And there was no for the Realty Board, there was no explicit racial segregation policy. We did not redline in Vancouver. That wasn't happening on the policy level. However, again, much like the VHA, you might not have that in policy, but some people might be practicing those discriminatory acts. And so it could be that individual realtors were refusing to show homes to Black folks, or in some other way sabotaging their efforts to secure housing. And so that's something to keep in mind as we're talking about this. By 1960, those concerned citizens who had appealed for affordable post-war housing and demanded race considerations play an integral role in suburban planning and development did not succeed as they'd hoped. That just did not pan out the way that they would like it to have panned out. For the most part, Vancouver's Black residents did not secure private housing in the city's new subdivisions, and very few stayed in the area. So again, in 1950, that Black population dropped down to 879, 10 years later to under 500 people. That big dramatic plummet from 9,000 people that we saw in the graph a few slides back. So that was a mass exodus very quickly, 15 years or more. You have thousands of people leaving. So the scant employment opportunities in Vancouver and Portland factored into many families' decisions to leave. And other cities in the country, including Seattle, were still offering a lot of post-war jobs. There was a boom in some cities. And so people were attracted to moving to those other areas to secure work for themselves. And a lot of our families a lot of Black families in Vancouver ended up moving to Portland because there'd been a long relationship between Portland and Vancouver Black communities, particularly through the churches. So the Vancouver NAACP Branch 1139, the legacy of having this remarkable group in our community is that they created a network of supports for each other, including other grassroots organizations. They grew leaders in their ranks. So this was a fertile training ground for people who would take those leadership skills to their professions, to their churches, to other civic organizations. They held local government and businesses accountable to the people. They were pushing for democracy and justice in all aspects of public life. They developed civic partnerships to magnify their impact, so they knew how to mobilize, how to work collectively with other groups so that they could have a compounded impact. They encouraged Black families to settle in different parts of Vancouver, different sections of the city. And they did this for two reasons. One, so that there would be no Black section of Vancouver that could be targeted for discrimination or violence. And two, to protect against the ghettoization of their neighborhood. So ghettos are created when entities like governments divest or disinvest, from an area that they deem unworthy of investment. And so once the government is not investing, there is little infrastructure to support businesses. And so businesses don't move in, and the tax revenue for an area can collapse, and then the whole area can collapse. And So ghettoization happens not because of people who live in those areas, but because of that purposeful disinvestment that then crumbles the infrastructure. And remember that these families were coming from places where they knew, they had personal firsthand experience of the targeting that can happen with Black communities, and they did not want to see that happen. And so they purposefully spread out to prevent that. And they set the foundation for today's still instrumental NAACP Branch 1139, still active and going strong. So the last piece I want to talk about is the book, First Families book. This was the culminating artifact from a many years project or program of ad hoc volunteers and sponsorship from the NAACP that allowed us to collect the stories, to interview First Families and collect their stories. And Jane Elder Wolfe wove it into this beautifully written narrative of the Black experience in Vancouver. So if you are interested in learning more about their stories and the personal stories of folks who came to this community and built it up for us, you can purchase this book. It's $20. All proceeds benefit the local NAACP. So you can learn and you can benefit this really important organization that has improved our community, not just for Black folks, but for all folks living here. So I appreciate your time. That concludes my presentation. I'm really glad that you could tune in. And I hope that you will learn more about this history and the wonderful people who have made this community a better place through their organizing and through their leadership. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is April Busby from the Clark County Historical Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today and on this presentation about the Black experience in housing post-World War II. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us. So Melissa is actually with us live right now to answer any questions that our viewers have. So feel free to jump in onto our live chat and put on questions, and then I will post them to Melissa. I'll also say, for those of you interested in getting a copy of First Families, not only does the NAACP have their own copies, but you can also purchase them online through the museum. So if you go to our online shop and pick it up, it'll be ready. It'll be available for curbside pickup or to be shipped to you. So there's lots of ways to get a copy of it. I would highly recommend it if you want to hear more about this story. And Melissa, did you want to say anything while we're waiting for any questions?
Sure. I'm always really excited to present this piece of our local history because the stories aren't so well known. And over the last few years, I'm running into more and more people who do know a little bit about it, just because several of us have been telling the story for a while. But it's always really interesting to hear from folks who have a personal connection to it. So meeting folks that I had not met before who moved to Vancouver during the war, that's always really rewarding to hear some of those firsthand stories. But I think it's really critical for us to understand how our history has been multicultural, multiracial, and of course in the 1800s and earlier, we had a really, for communities back then, for white areas back then, we had a really diverse population with folks who were connected to Fort Vancouver, Pacific Islanders, and we've had Chinese immigrants working in this area. So there's a long history of diversity here that often is not told. So it's good to dive into it.
Okay, so we have a question. One of the questions you're being asked is, can you talk about how this story impacts housing issues in Vancouver today?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit harder for me because I don't study up to the, I don't study the recent things so much. But I think maybe some of the connection, and this isn't just for Vancouver, but lots of places, some of the connection might be still that stigma around public housing and the people who are accessing public housing. I think that has been an issue in a lot of cities in our country, but definitely that played out here as the city planners were reluctant to offer that, to offer affordable homes for people and to move into that private model. So I think that's one thing. There are probably many more, but that's one thing that I think probably is a holdover, and that kind of that expectation that people should be able to afford moderately expensive or expensive homes on their own. That does shape definitely the demographics of a city.
Definitely. So Steve is asking, I'm wondering if there's a comparison of post-war data on white people who found private employment after World War II.
You know, there probably is, but I wasn't looking so much into that. And, you know, I think we're lucky, you know, folks who are studying history are so lucky to have those Vancouver Housing Authority records. And so I'm sure that there's a lot related to that, those statistics in those documents and other documents, but I hadn't looked so much into comparing with white folks. But we do know that the population of white people in Vancouver didn't drop off at the rates that the Black population in Vancouver dropped off. And so we know that there were some of those push factors happening. And we also know just from interviewing, you know, narrators and these first families, what their experience was and how difficult it could be to put roots down, that certainly I'm sure some white families experienced, but not at that systemic level, probably.
And I will say to anyone who's interested, this is an area that we are diving into more with our partners at the NAACP and with other groups who are interested in kind of looking at this post-war period and what happened to not only the Black community, but also other communities who came here for those jobs that then disappeared. So we're always looking for people who are interested in continuing this research.
Mm-hmm.
So, Melissa, do you know approximately how large the current Black population is in the area?
Yeah, I don't know now. And of course, the census information is going to come out soon, but I do have from the 2010 census. So the Black population of Vancouver is about 3%. So it's just under 5,000 folks at the 2010 count. So very small, and that's actually been pretty consistent with censuses in the past, that the Black population hovers around 3% of the population. I'd expect though for 2020, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens. It could go up a little bit.
All righty. It looks like that's what we have, unless we have anyone else who's got a question they'd like to throw out there. We will, otherwise we'll wrap up.
Last chance.
All right, so it looks like that's all the questions for today. So I want to thank you again, Melissa, for joining us, and for all the work you've done on this over the years. We really enjoy it, and I appreciate it, as I've used a lot of your research myself for my own stuff. To everybody out there, thank you for joining us again. Be sure to check out our upcoming History on Tap. The tickets will go on sale in the next couple of days, and we have a lot of exciting things going around that. And then also be sure to check out our upcoming speaker series for March, which will be looking at the 1918 flu pandemic. So we look forward to seeing everyone again. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them. If not here, then we'll filter them into Facebook over the next few days. So having a good night, everyone.
Great.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you.